Hey, everybody. If you're listening to this, you are listening to the first free hour of this episode of The Shift with Doug McKinney. If you like what you're hearing, please consider subscribing to the show in order to access the full feature-length versions of the podcast, as well as have access to the members forum, where we discuss potential topics and interviews and dive deep into the overall concept of The Shift. For only $6 a month, not only do you get the full-length episodes, but also an opportunity to co-create with me, your host, Doug McKinney, the future of the show. Go to www.theshiftnow.com or patreon.com/theshift and sign up today in order to help make the shift possible. Thanks for listening and enjoy the show. Good morning, noon, or night, wherever and whenever you are listening to The Shift. I'm your host. My name is Doug McKinney. This episode was recorded on December 10th, 2021. For this milestone 100th episode of The Shift, I'm happy to announce special guest Dr. Cynthia McKinney. Dr. McKinney was a 6-term member of the House of Representatives and the first African-American woman to represent the state of Georgia at the federal level. While in Congress, she fought tirelessly to reduce corporate influence, spoke vociferously against the U.S. invasion of Iraq, and questioned the official narrative concerning the events of 9/11. Perhaps most controversially, she openly admonished then-Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld concerning sex trafficking allegations against military contractor DynCorp. During her time in Congress, she consistently voted against excessive military spending, and in a final act of defiance presented articles of impeachment against President George Bush for deceiving Congress into war with Iraq and increasing domestic spying against citizens of the United States. After leaving the Democratic Party, Dr. McKinney ran for president on the Green Party ticket in 2008. Once out of political office, she continued her activism by attempting on 2 occasions to transport medical and school supplies to Palestinians adversely affected by the Israeli blockade. The second attempt resulted in her arrest, and she spent 7 days in an Israeli prison for her efforts. She also engaged in the 2010 cross-country Bike for Peace initiative in protest of the Libyan invasion. In 2016, she teamed with conservative activist Robert David Steele in an attempt to combat corporate corruption through the #Unrig movement, which sought to bridge the left-right divide by facilitating the common goal of addressing systemic issues threatening democratic processes within the United States. Dr. McKinney received her PhD in Leadership and Change from Antioch University and now teaches at North South University in Bangladesh. Her books include Illegal War in Libya, Ain't Nothing Like Freedom, and most recently, When China Sneezes, From the Coronavirus Lockdown to the Global Political Economic Crisis. Stay tuned for a deep dive into modern political dialogue as Dr. McKinney and I discuss the current political landscape using the work of communist educator Paulo Freire to build a framework within which we will interpret the events of the past 2 years. In his seminal work, The Pedagogy of the Oppressed, Freire was critical of many communist movements for utilizing propaganda tactics rather than community dialogue to impose ideology through indoctrination, instead of facilitating liberation through a respect for individual critical thinking. This conversation speaks to real concerns that much of modern political dialogue has digressed into the overly simplistic and oppressive methodology of propaganda, and now engages in just the type of indoctrinating pedagogy Freire warned of decades ago. Find out more about the work of Dr. Cynthia McKinney at www.allthingscynthiamckinney.com. To find out more about The Shift, sign up for the newsletter, subscribe for feature-length episodes, or discover hours of free content. Go to www.theshiftnow.com. You can also get more information at Doug McKinney on Facebook, at DMcKinney on Twitter, and find the program on Rockfin, Odyssey, and all your favorite podcast distribution platforms. If you like what you're hearing, please like, subscribe, and share this content throughout your social media networks. We rely on listeners like you for distribution of this alternative content. Without further ado, I want to thank Dr. Cynthia McKinney for agreeing to this interview, and thank you for helping to make the shift. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this special 100th episode of The Shift, and I'm happy to introduce my guest today as Dr. Cynthia McKinney. We've been trying to organize this for a little over a year now, actually, and it's finally come together. And I think she was just waiting to be my 100th guest. So I guess I can preface this a little bit by saying I had been looking for an excuse to read Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed for many years, actually. And then I thought Dr. McKinney would be the perfect person to do an interview about it, since she's been so politically active in the past and is a teacher of political science now. And when I read the book, frankly, I was just blown away. We were just talking before the show about how I come typically from the libertarian perspective, getting more and more libertarian left every day. And when I read this book, which is Paulo Freire is typically considered a communist, I was kind of looking for reasons to disagree with him, but frankly, it was just 100% spot on. And so I'm really looking forward to having this conversation. We're going to talk about the pedagogy of the oppressed, and then expand to the general use of propaganda all over the world, including in the United States. Yes, believe it or not, everybody. And then kind of focus in on this whole COVID situation and how so many of us have been influenced by the rampant propaganda that's going on. So welcome to the show, Dr. McKinney. Really appreciate it. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. And for you, I mean, I had to work hard to get that PhD, but you can call me Cynthia.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Yeah, because I'm never really that formal. I'm
Yeah.
not a formal person at all.
Well, fair enough. I like to be informal myself, but I do like to give credit where it's due. So, well, anyway, Cynthia, would you like to just give a little bit of your history and background? I imagine most of my audience knows who you are, but just to fill in the gaps for those who don't.
Well, there's a lot to tell in that background, so I could just say that I served in the Georgia legislature for 4 years. I served in the U.S. Congress for 12 years, and during that time, I guess both of those tenures, I became what Al Gore called the spunky person. And he was being kind, right, because I've been called much worse.
Yeah.
And and it's all true. So but the problem is that you're not supposed to be spunky in front of power. You're not supposed to be inconveniently telling the truth, and
right,
those inconvenient truths in front of power. And so I suffered the results of, I'm not the only one who has done that. And
sure,
I'm not the only one who has suffered as a result. So I've lived through my suffering, and I'm still here to tell the story. So they didn't get me yet.
Well, and that's great for the rest of us. Frankly, Cynthia, I've been following your work for years. Like I said, I come from this libertarian perspective, but I've been really trying to figure out how to, because I can see, and I know, as we were discussing again prior, you were working on the hashtag unrigged with Robert David Steele, trying to unite the left and the right. And I just can so easily perceive that this left-right paradigm is a divide and conquer technique. And as we get into discussing the propaganda, maybe we can relate it to this, because it's almost like if people identify as left wing or if they identify as right wing, it's so easy for the propaganda to just target that ready-made audience. And then they're just, I think, can we use the word hypnotized? They're just hypnotized into following what the propaganda is telling them. And they've already got a good 30 or 40% of the population that they know is going to follow and advocate for whatever. I mean, if you're right wing, I always just go back to the propaganda before the 2003 invasion of Iraq. If you're left wing, I think safe to say a lot of this COVID propaganda has really sucked a lot of people on the left away from thinking objectively about some of the data, some of the science, some of the alternative opinions.
Well,
that are
I would call that the faux left, the fake left. So, I mean, because now we also have embedded in the system, on top of it, we've got the manufactured consent and the manufactured dissent. So whereas maybe in the past there was this real left, right dialogue that needed to take place that wasn't taking place. They were basically talking to each other, and I'm talking to those of the same political philosophy and not to each other. But now we've got this George Soros phenomenon of the manufactured left and the manufactured right, and they are talking to each other and utilizing the media. And then we, who are the real left and the real right, have basically lost our voices. And then, of course, what I have grown fond of saying, that with this new paradigm in place and different, how can I say, different criteria, different needs, that I'm so far left that I'm right.
Yeah, that's what's happening to me. I went so far right that I'm left, and it's like, what's going on? And that's why, actually, I think the dialectical paradigm, the left-right paradigm, is not really accurate, because you can kind of move through these concepts and realize that it's more holistic. Political philosophy should be more holistic, I think, than this left-right paradigm makes us think, you know?
Right. But you see, so you and I are fluid in our sort of self-identifications.
Right.
So we understand that the tectonic plates that undergird our political philosophy and our placement of ourselves within that terrain, well, those plates are shifting, just like they're shifting right now with the geomagnetic excursion that's going on, and all the earthquakes and the volcanoes and everything that's happening. So our political ground has shifted as well. Now, there are some people who recognize that, and there are a whole lot of people who don't.
Right.
So you and I, we recognize that. So now, for an example, there's a particular doctor that I've been trying to reach out to, because she has a platform, and it's an important platform of other MDs and PhDs that are in the biomedical field. Now, of course, I'm not there, but the problems that we're having now are not just biomedical, they're political.
Yeah.
And people have to understand that, but they also have to understand that the tectonic plates on which we stand have also shifted. What has happened is that she refuses to talk to me. Now, why would she refuse to talk to me? Because she views me as a communist who, this is what I'm reputed to be, which is all incorrect. But anyway,
right.
I'm a communist so far to the left that she could not possibly have anything in common with me, and certainly couldn't listen or share anything in a conversation with me. So I've been ignored. But the problem that she will experience is she'll never be able to resolve the problem that she is experiencing until she understands that those old rigid identifications and boxes have been obliterated now, right. And that we are no longer in any box unless we choose to put ourselves in one, as she has put herself in a box. I've taken away all of the boxes, and now, as a result of that, I'm able to break bread and make friends across all of the lines that basically are supposed to divide us.
It's so important what you're talking about, and what a great segue into the pedagogy of the oppressed, because I think I've seen this too. When people self-identify as left or right, then they're stuck in what Paulo Freire describes as this dialectical thinking. And then they're unable to listen, or what he describes as dialogue, with people from the other side. And then the education stops. There's no pedagogy. There's no
That's
authentic
right.
pedagogy that's occurring any longer. We're not learning from each other. We're not listening to each other. We're stuck inside of this
That's right.
box. And I've seen so many people, because they self-identify with one or the other, they're not fluid. I think this may even be what's meant by the term the colonized mind. Actually, I think the
Yes.
decolonizing of your mind is this process of being able
Yes.
to let go of this self-identity and have this fluidity about the left and the right and different ideas. So do you want to dive into some of this and maybe relate it back to pedagogy of the oppressed?
Sure. So let me look and see. I have a signature. See if I can find an email that I've sent that has this. In my signature, it says, "Make your spirit flexible, and nothing will ever bend you out of shape."
Yeah.
And I just love that. That's from a little book called Wisdom by Taro Gold. And he's a young man who reached out to me. But, age has nothing to do with wisdom, and
Right.
he's young, and that came from him. And it's a wonderful way to look at ourselves, and then, of course, to look at the world. So basically, um, in this political science, I teach, or I used to teach, and now I'm about to go back and start teaching again.
Mm-hmm.
Um, uh, Political Science 101. So just plain introduction to political science. Now, of course, I don't consider myself a political scientist because all of my studies have been geared toward international relations. And so that
Okay.
was my master's. And then my PhD, which was in leadership and change, was still in the area of international affairs. So I consider myself that rather than a political scientist. But anyway, we all get pigeonholed.
Mm-hmm.
And so
Right.
in the university setting, I was pigeonholed to be a political science teacher. So as a part of understanding the sort of my clientele or my customer base, which is the students, English language university in Bangladesh. So these are at least dual language students, um, and their families. They come from well off enough families that they can afford to pay the tuition, which is not cheap. Um, to go to this school where every one of the professors studied outside of Bangladesh. And so they bring this international perspective back into it. It really is a wonderful idea, in my opinion, about technology transfer and knowledge transfer in a very serious way for the so-called third world. Well, anyway, because I'm there and there's this colonial background that has to be dealt with, and the colonial mindset that has to be dealt with, one of the other um, quotes that I have in my signature comes from, let me just find it here, comes from Steve Biko. And it says, "The biggest weapon in the hands of the oppressors is the minds of the oppressed." So if you want to, the purpose of the institution, so I go back to the mission statement of the institution itself. You want to create a citizenry that is informed, educated, and able to lead. So you are creating the leaders of today and tomorrow for the country of Bangladesh. One of the ways that the only way, in my opinion, that one can truly become a leader of one's people is by the process of decolonizing one's mindset.
Mm-hmm.
And so I give my students just an introduction, but it's a necessary introduction, in my opinion, of Frantz Fanon, Paulo Freire, Mario Cézanne, And those are the three thinkers of the day, decolonization thinkers of that period, the 50s and the 60s. Mm-hmm. And when I started out with Frantz Fanon, who was the first and also quite controversial, and then Paulo Freire was reading Frantz Fanon and saying, "Wow, wait a minute! I'm in Brazil, and we were colonized by the Portuguese." But the exact same phenomenon that Fanon is discussing, which was about French colonization, the practices and the psychology of it, which is what Frantz Fanon was talking about, because he studied psychiatry. Mm-hmm. So Freire says, I'm experiencing the same thing. And so that's how you got the beginning of colonization, decolonization studies, because the people who were actually subject to the practice of colonialism came together and understood that there were certain phenomena that were the same. And the impact of these phenomena on the particular individuals was the same. So there are some things, it doesn't matter where I go. Like, for example, you can get at the very end of my course, I play a piece from James Wolfenson, the former president of the World Bank, who's talking about the 80-20 rule. And he says that he could go anywhere in the world with the knowledge that he had the 80-20 rule securely locked into his hip pocket. And I asked my students to please translate that for me. What does he mean by that? What he means is that as a European who has white skin, he is able to go all over the world to where people don't have white skin, who wish they did have white skin, and he's able to experience the presumption of intellectual superiority, financial superiority, political superiority, amid the presumption of those who don't have white skin of inferiority. And that was the way, that's the apartheid on which the entire international system is built. And this speech is before the Stanford MBA students, and it's a very important speech. You can find it on my YouTube channel, Run Cynthia Run, and just an excerpt, not the whole thing, because it's about an hour for the whole thing, but the excerpt I have is about 3 minutes. But that's the crux of it. And then he says that a tectonic shift is about to take place where that 80-20 rule is no longer going to be operative, because the 80% of global GDP that the approximately 1 billion Europeans, wherever they are situated in the world, experience, and the 20% of global GDP that the remaining 6 billion people have to eke out a living with is going to change. And we are sort of in the cusp of that change right now, where we are seeing a decline that is being hastened by certain events, which I'm sure we'll talk about later, but a decline in living standards, a decline in life expectancy in the West, and that's being met with certain rises in the non-West part of the world. And so now this is happening literally as you and I are having this conversation. but it's not happening in the way that people like Frantz Fanon or Paulo Freire, particularly Frantz Fanon, Amilcar Cabral, they thought, or even Che Guevara for that matter, thought that there was going to be, for example, 1, 2, 3 Vietnams, which is what Che said, that it was going to be done violently and through revolution. Well, we are kind of experiencing a revolution, but it's not a revolution of our choice, of our choosing. It's not a revolution of our making even. And that's what makes it a faux revolution with faux left, faux right, faux players. And then you and I have to have the kind of flexibility to be able to understand what is happening and not be tied to this old construct, because the construct itself is being obliterated before our very eyes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it seems to me like what we're dealing with right now is basically an inundation of propaganda, and it's better from my perspective. You know, I was trying to analyze this basically in a critical thinking, logical argument kind of way, and then I realized I think what we're dealing with here is very much more of a psychological situation. I mean,
absolutely,
they have, instead of using military weaponry, it is psychological operations now, and they've just moved on into this psychological realm using propaganda. And that's where the pedagogy of oppressed also comes in, because this is what he was noticing in terms of how oppressed classes are inundated and influenced with this propaganda. And I think he was even critical, say, of Chairman Mao or the Chinese revolutions in China and the Soviet Union for implementing the same kind of propagandizing techniques to make the transition post-revolution from quote-unquote capitalism to quote-unquote communism. And he had concerns that this wasn't going to work, because if you're using the same pedagogy, then you're continuing to colonize and oppress. You're not actually liberating people unless you are teaching them through this process of dialogue rather than through this process of propaganda.
Well, you're absolutely right about that. And, you know, actually, I had not thought about that in terms of how I'm seeing these revolutionary forces sort of that are taking place trying to change our world as we know it. They are trying to change the world through revolution, and they are using the propagandist techniques. So you're absolutely right on target on that. And I had not thought about the manipulation that occurs as a result of this use of propaganda. If I may, what I would like to do is talk to you for a minute about why I fell in love with Pedagogy of the Oppressed. Now, it's not that the other thinkers, and I include Kwame Nkrumah, who gave us a new terminology for the way the world was constructed, neocolonialism. But what Freire does, and it's that the reading is like a buildup. So you get into it, and he's talking about the role of the teacher. And in a classroom, either the teacher, sort of the hierarchical structure of a classroom. So the teacher is really authoritarian, the representation of authoritarianism.
Yeah.
And the teacher knows everything and the student knows nothing. Well, this is exactly the opposite of what Pedagogy of the Oppressed is all about or advocates. Because I know when I went to Bangladesh, I had never been to Bangladesh before. And so therefore, I needed to learn. Who was I most suited to learn from? My students.
Yep.
And so rather than rather than engaging them as I know everything, I would tell them, look, you know everything about Bangladesh, and I know everything about the United States. Let's see how we can teach each other about our countries. What are our cultures? What are our expectations? What are our values? And so the only way that can happen is if we talk to each other.
Yeah.
And I admit that I don't know everything.
Yeah. That's key.
That's right. That's right.
It's the arrogance of the teaching methodology, and what you're talking and what you're describing reminds me so vividly of what we've heard 1,000 times over the last year and a half, which is listen to the experts, listen to the experts. There have been articles out saying don't do your own research because you're not going to be able to figure it out. You have to listen to the experts. And this is exactly the oppressive pedagogy that Freire is talking about, where they're not engaging in an actual dialogue. He talks about, and I like this perspective because we often hear about the alienation that occurs with people who grow up inside of this colonial mindset. They're force-fed an education from an authoritarian figure. They're not allowed to express their own personal creativity. And then when they go on in life, they're typically getting a job where they have to do what the boss tells them. And again, they're not, expressing their own creativity, their own personal will. They become really disassociated emotionally from their labor. This is a common theme in a lot of the communist works. And so Freire really addresses this and says we have to change the entire educational model so that it's based on allowing each individual in each community to essentially participate in their own educational process. We have to allow them to be able to cultivate their own culture, their own history, their own interpretations of their own community values, rather than trying to impose communist values or capitalist values, however you want to, whatever oppressive force you're dealing with propaganda and authoritarianism.
Well, in a colonized world, we could apply this concept on the international level as well. And so in a colonized world, there have been certain values, morals that have been presumed to be better. And there's certain, even down to sports. And this is some of the things that we discuss in the classroom, how the Bangladeshis had their own sports. And then after colonialism, they adopted the sports of the Brit. They were colonized by the British and then indirectly by the Americans, the US people, I shouldn't say Americans, but by the United States. And so therefore, their values became sort of US light or England light.
Right.
And they are alienated from themselves and they end up hating themselves. And this is exactly the kind of psychology that Frantz Fanon was discussing in his great works. Oh gosh, his medical thesis, his medical dissertation was Black Skin, White Masks.
Okay.
And then he wrote after that, it went around the world because people everywhere who were colonized understood immediately what he was describing, the self-hatred, the duality that one experiences when one has been colonized and the values that are being imposed on you from outside, from those who presume themselves to be superior to you. And what that goes, how that affects the psyche. So anyway, what I do in my course is I ask the students, so I introduce them slowly to organizations that represent the decolonization aspiration, like, for example, the non-aligned movement, which came after World War II. Also, the organizations that are being created now, like the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, AIIB, Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the Eurasian Economic Community. So you've got all of these, the New Development Bank from, see, I've forgotten a lot since I haven't been teaching for 2 years, but you've got all of these organizations that sprang from this feeling of otherness that colonialism created. Well, as Frady builds us up to like what the responsibility of the teacher is, what the responsibility of the student is, what I really wanted was a solution. And I was looking for, well, is he going to go there? Is he really going to go there?
Right.
How far is he going to go? Because, you know, people are celebrating that Rand Paul is saying things in the Congress to Fauci that need to be said. But Rand Paul he's only going halfway, in my opinion, because he could go all the way. But he's not going all the way.
Yeah.
He's not putting his leadership on the line for the whole truth. And so I wanted to know if Paulo Freire was going to do so. And at the very end of the book, all I could say was, oh my gosh, he went there. He did it. So now what I want to tell you is what it was that he did that was so right on target and that makes Pedagogy of the Oppressed timeless for me. Mm-hmm. He describes the mechanisms of oppression. And the important thing is that this is not just about colonialism, or as you say, if we view colonialism through many different prisms, then we can find it in everything. We can find it in what is happening today to the world, to all of us. So, conquest, the very first mechanism of oppression. There is conquest of some sort. Second, divide and rule. And we see this happening all the time. There was a conquest, and then there was divide and rule. There was a conquest of the West, and then there is divide and rule. So now, how many different identities can I have? I can be African American. I can be American. I can be U.S. citizen. I can be gay, transgender. I can, there's a Democrat, Republican. There's so many male, female. I mean,
right.
There's so many different sub-identities that can be created. Gilad Atzmon writes about, in Being in Time, he writes about the politically purposeful deconstruction of identity so that so that divide and rule is taken down actually literally to the cellular level. We can discuss that when we talk about SARS, coronavirus 2, and COVID. How far down can we be divided? And that's a process that's being done now. You talk about propaganda.
Yeah.
Number 3 on Freire's mechanisms of oppression is manipulation. We are all being manipulated. You are correct to say that this is a vast global psychological operation that we are a part of, or maybe being victimized by.
Yeah.
And then the final mechanism of oppression, which is what I try to introduce my students to, this notion of cultural invasion, so that all of the tactics and techniques of oppression become internalized. And so now they're just normal. So it's normal for me to hate my black skin.
Right.
It's normal for me to hate my kinky, coily hair. That becomes normal. And it's not normal.
Yeah.
It's been imposed from outside. But then he's not satisfied enough in just diagnosing the problem. He also gives us a solution to our problem. And then he mentions to us the tools for liberation. So we have mechanisms of oppression that operate to keep us divided and down. But we, the individuals, can find our own power and use them as tools for liberation. So now what are they? And this is why I just love Pedagogy of the Oppressed.
Mm-hmm.
Unity for liberation is a tool for liberation. Now, it means that you, Doug, and me, Cynthia, I'm on the left, you're on the right. But things have become so bad that we are together on the left and the right.
Yeah, we are.
Okay? But whatever our differences are, we don't ignore them, but we recognize that we will never be able to throw off this yoke of oppression if we don't unite. So we find a way to come together. Unity for liberation doesn't mean we have to be the same, but we have to be on the same struggle, on the same side, wearing the same uniform. Because quite frankly, the way we got into this mess is that some people we thought were wearing our uniform and they were working for the other side. The other is cooperation. So now if they are going to divide us, we got to figure out a way to cooperate with each other.
Right.
And not allow them to divide us. He says the third is organization. We're not going to do it alone. We have to be able to come together in unity for liberation by means of cooperation. And one of the things that I tell my students about that embodies this idea, well, actually, there's a Bangladeshi example where they have this two-party duopoly as well. And both of those parties were overthrown and a military dictator came in for Bangladesh. And so the people, the two parties were fed up with the dictatorship, although my students tell me they love the dictatorship. So really? That's a whole different thing as well.
Yeah.
So now what is necessary? The political parties say, we need some power, and this military man ain't giving it to us. So the two parties came together, and they didn't become each other, but they just came together to tell the dictator it's time to go. And that's what happened. So it's unity for a specific purpose of liberation. And then the final, and so now when it comes to organization, let me just say this, add this. What I talk to my students about on the international level or the international scale is that you've got these organizations like the AIIB, the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the SCO. You've got the New Development Bank, and it comes out of, now see, I've forgotten that one. But you've got these organizations, Eurasian Economic EAEU, Economic Union, that's led by the Russians. And so you've got all of these different organizations. The West, you see, set up the IMF, the World Bank, the United Nations. And what is it that the West, when they set these organizations up, wanted? They wanted perpetuation of Western power and the West and the 80-20 rule that James Wolfenson spoke about to the Stanford University students. And what is the goal of the AIIB and the SCO and the EAEU and all of these other, or the non-aligned movement, the NAM? What's the goal of these organizations? It's to throw off the oppression on the international scale and allow these individual countries that were formerly colonized to be able to experience some freedom themselves. So the final ingredient, just as you had cultural invasion, which is the normalization of the culture of oppression in as a mechanism of oppression, the tool for liberation is cultural synthesis. You're creating a new culture. What is that new culture? It's the culture of freedom. It's the culture of liberation. It's the culture of sovereignty, something that has been denied you if you're talking about a state, that you've been denied sovereignty. And now it's to the point where we in the United States are experiencing an infringement of our sovereignty by some authorities from on high who think that they can run a psychological operation on us and that we will fold and cave in and become docile servants.
If you are listening to this, you are listening to the first free hour of The Shift with Doug McKinney. For access to the full feature-length versions of the podcast, go to www.theshiftnow.com and subscribe for the audio version for just $6 a month. Access the full-length episodes in video form through rockfin.com by subscribing at the Shift with Doug McKinney landing page. For $9.99 a month, you gain access not only to The Shift, but also all other premium content material hosted on the platform. Find out more at www.theshiftnow.com/store. Detoxify your body, decolonize your mind, make the shift. Well, we're hitting on an hour. I know you're a busy person. Do you have time for one more question, maybe 10 more minutes or so? Or okay, great. Because I did want to take some time to be able to discuss When China Sneezes, which you edited. It's a compilation of multiple essays by a variety of different people. I was happy to see Whitney Webb in there.
Yes.
And I did want to ask you one question too about the Chinese in general. The first chapter or two were fairly pro-China in terms of the lockdowns and how they dealt with COVID. And I have my concerns about that the Western elite are actually favoring the Chinese system at this point because of the social credit system and the way. Well,
here's what I have to say about that.
Okay.
People are talking about social credit as if there's no social credit system already in place in the United States.
Right.
What do you call the credit score?
Right.
And it determines what kind of job you can get, or whether you get a job at all, where you can live, how well you can live. It determines all of that. Yeah. So why don't talk to me about, I'm afraid of the communist Chinese. But now let's pay attention to something that's happening right now. And that is Evergrande. Because now, when the United States had its moment, the capitalists decided to pump public money Well, what do they call that? Socializing the debt.
Yeah.
They privatize the profit and socialize the debt.
Yeah, classic.
What did the communists do? Well, the authorities in China said on Evergrande, now we'll see what they do, but they told the billionaire owner of Evergrande, use your personal wealth to pay that debt. Now, did we ever hear that coming from anybody in the United States? Heck, no. Is that what should have happened? Heck, yes. So now you've already got some segment of this investor class, this billionaire class, that have invested in Evergrande, which means they're going to take a hit, which is why George Soros is on the warpath against China.
Sure.
Right now, because maybe the cash cow that they thought that they were milking just went dry. We don't know, but what we do know is that there was a systematic buildup of China for the purpose of, I believe, of being the next Cold War. We got to do this. And the fact that the Chinese are not of the same race also plays a role in this. Mm-hmm. And it makes it real easy for people to say, I hate the Chinese. And they don't even know anything about China. Don't even know a Chinese person. And the one that they know is from that 1% that got divested of their, sort of like the Miami Cubans.
Right.
So I think, which is how that book came to be, is because I was in China. I was in China for another reason, because the United States was beating the war drums against China about the way the Muslims in Xinjiang province were being treated, the Uyghurs. So I decided that I would go and I would see for myself how the Uyghurs are treated. But I didn't want to go by myself. So I put out a call on Facebook and Twitter. And I said, who wants to go to China with me? We got, of course, you got to pay your own way. I'm paying my way. We go to China, and we embedded ourselves in, Han and non-Han Muslim China for the purpose of understanding what it was like to be a Muslim in China, because those were the war drums that were beating at the time. Then while we were there, that's when the whole SARS coronavirus 2 thing happened. We never went to Wuhan, so we didn't know anything about it. We were wedded to the news, but it just wasn't in the English language news, and it wasn't in the national China news because it wasn't a big issue at that time. Mm-hmm. And so when we came back, like maybe 5 days after our tour ended, or maybe it was 10 days after the tour ended, China locked down. And then Italy locked down, United States locked down, the whole world locked down. And then I said, hey, we got to wait a little while on the Uyghur book, and we're going to write a book about this. So that meant that all of the people who went there with me, I had to find new people to be contributors. I had to find people who were aware, knowledgeable about China. So I found people who live in China. I found non-Chinese who could step back and be a little bit more objective, who live in China. And then I just happened to be on a plane, and I met someone, a very high person in China, who agreed to write anonymously a chapter in the book. So I got a Chinese person, non-Chinese, who live in Chinese. Americans who live in China. I got Michael Hudson, world famous economist William Robinson, also writing about the global economy. Jack Rasmus writing about the economy. I got Whitney Webb writing about DARPA. I wrote the chapter about genocide because, quite frankly, if you go to Project for a New American Century and you read page 60 of their document, Rebuilding America's Defenses, you will see that they wrote, let me see if I have it just handy here. You will see that they wrote, this is a quote, I have it there. Advanced forms of biological warfare that can target specific genotypes may transform biological warfare from the realm of terror to a politically useful tool. Right. So now, is SARS coronavirus 2 a politically useful tool? That's the question that I ask and that I answer in my chapter and that this whole book is about.
Yep. It's a fascinating read. I'd recommend it to anyone who's listening. It's an interesting question to me. I hear you about the BRIC nations, about standing up to Western colonialism.
Yeah, that's what I'm talking about. Yeah, the New Development Bank from Brazil, Russia, India,
right,
and China. Yeah, BRIC.
And I see these forces pulling away. I think my only question is, in my mind, and I certainly see what you're talking about with the propaganda, the anti-China propaganda, the anti-Russia propaganda. Kind of funny. People on the left are supposed to hate Russia. People on the right are supposed to hate China. Another divide and conquer, but still building up towards a potential warfare scenario. Almost in my mind, I'm wondering if the elites. But I guess ultimately, because I always try to put myself in the place of these people and see what is the big picture, what are they thinking, and when I keep in mind the lockstep scenario from the Rockefeller Foundation discussing the potential for the vaccine and everyone following the Chinese model on the lockdowns and people in the West being worried about authoritarianism, but eventually, basically predicting exactly what's happening now. I just question, and again, thinking from their perspective, these guys have gotten so transnational that I almost wonder if they are attracted to a more Chinese system, and they're intentionally weakening the West in order to build up this globalist system that they've been working on. So they're using the coronavirus to weaken the West, almost promote the Chinese system to a certain degree from their point of view, because I think that the upper classes they're making great money off the Chinese system. These sort of capitalist communist
so far, fusions. Yeah. But
but
they're not doing anything they didn't do with Russia when it went Soviet.
Sure.
So it's the same process. And I think we have to look at it as the same process. This isn't about China. China has it's the yellow peril and it's all that baggage, the racial baggage that goes along with it. But it's the same process. It's the same template. They're running it again. And anybody who falls for that, I think they're basically neutralizing themselves out of the struggle because they're going to get diverted to focus on China when they need to be focused on the 1%.
Yeah. Well, I can't agree with that. I agree with that 100%. That we should be focusing on the 1%, and that people, no matter where they live, should have the freedom to have a sovereign and autonomous decision making, and that's especially going back to this. Having a participatory pedagogy within each and every community to be able to cultivate their own cultural values and their own systems of governance, separate from this colonizing machine. So we'll see how it all plays out.
We certainly will, and I look forward to coming back and having a second conversation. Now,
absolutely.
Yeah. So actually. Let's organize that for, say, let's wait a couple of months and see how things play out. And,
okay.
Maybe the next time you talk to me, I'll be in Bangladesh.
Yeah, sounds great, Cynthia. Thank you so much. I really I enjoyed this conversation. I enjoyed a few years back when I talked to you with Robert David Steele about the hashtag unrig. I really appreciate that even when we do have differences of opinion, I know that we're going to have a dialogue about it and we're going to actually be able to listen to each other. So
Exactly. I mean, that's the whole point. We'll end up more genuinely uh, embracing each other than what I saw in Capitol Hill, which actually was my first eye opener.
right.
And that is when the chairman is calling, he's a Democrat, and he's calling a meeting and a hearing, and he's supposed to just rake the Republican witness over the coals. And he does that in front of the cameras, and then they walk out arm in arm together.
Wow.
So it's all political theater up there.
Yeah.
But for us, it's the real deal. So that's what I appreciate.
Absolutely. Well, thanks so much for coming on, and I'd love to talk to you anytime. So we'll get back in touch in a bit. Will you let people know where they can find out more about your stuff?
Well, my books are on Amazon, and if you don't like Amazon, they're on Barnes and Noble. They're all published by Clarity Press, so you can go to Clarity Press and get the book there if you want to sort of experience a different view of SARS, coronavirus 2, and COVID. We put that book to bed in like June of 2020. So it was, if it wasn't the first, it was among the first books that was written about it. And we wanted to be holistic in our approach to include the politics of SARS coronavirus 2. And now that that's being played out, and we're living the politics of SARS coronavirus 2 right now.
Well, very good, Cynthia. Thanks again. I'll just let people know you've been listening to The Shift. I'm your host, Doug McKinney, and I'm urging, if you like what you're hearing, you can go to my website, www.theshiftnow.com. Sign up for the newsletter is the best way to stay constantly in touch. You can look up Doug McKinney on Facebook. I'm on Twitter at @DMcKinney. Right now, those are my most common social media sites, and my show, The Shift with Doug McKinney, is up on YouTube, although I actually most of my stuff I don't even post on YouTube anymore, and so you can find it on Rockfin or Odyssey, which are more censorship-free platforms. So thanks everybody for listening, and thank you so much, Cynthia, for coming on. Really enjoyed the conversation. We'll talk again.
Thank you so much, Doug.
You bet. Take care.
Bye-bye.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, there you go. That was my interview with Dr. Cynthia McKinney. I've been trying to get her on the show for, I think it's been over a year now. We first started having conversations about doing this a while back because I've been looking for an excuse to read The Pedagogy of the Oppressed by Paulo Freire for quite a while. I believe he's the person that has coined the term decolonize the mind. Or at least that's an outgrowth of his work. And I've always thought that was such an important term. And I wanted to go back and I wanted to actually read the primary documentation where these concepts kind of came from. And Paulo, of course, Freire is a predominant communist writer, very left-wing. But I'm always looking, as you all know, if you're familiar with the program, I'm always looking for ways to bring the left-right paradigm together. And I have to say, I was absolutely blown away by this book. For a communist writer, and I typically prefer libertarian ideas. I am a fan of a free market. I don't see a disconnect between the liberal philosophy of individual freedoms with the concept of having a free market. I actually really feel like they're melded. They're one and the same. Cynthia would probably disagree with me on that, but but nonetheless, more and more I've become left libertarian in that I think in a free society, certainly we should all choose, of course, to work collectively together and to help each other out and to develop all kinds of consensual organizations that are community-based, helping poor people, making sure everybody gets adequate health care, things like that. And there are lots of ideas from the left that we can implement them, in my opinion, as long as people can choose to participate. They're not forced or mandated to participate in these things. And so I've been kind of cultivating this left libertarianism idea with a few interviews more and more. And so I wanted to read Freire to see what his perspective was, and I was actually just blown away about how much I enjoyed his work. And the central concepts, as you just heard, we spoke about some of them. But basically, it's this idea that if you teach people from this authoritarian perspective, which we all, if you went to public school, I mean, the modern day teaching methodologies are exactly this. The teacher is the authority. You've got to do what you're told. You've got to regurgitate what they say to you. Freire called it the banking method of education, where you just assume the student is got this empty bank account, and you've got to fill it with the knowledge that the authority knows is true. And then uncritically, the student is supposed to sort of fill the bank account with this knowledge in this way. And his perspective, and I think there's a lot of truth behind it, is that if you're raised under this type of pedagogy, you're literally being essentially propagandized into a kind of a Stockholm syndrome. You're not taught how to critically think. You're not taught you're not taught that it's safe to express your individuality from your own feelings, from your own history, based on your own experiences. Those are invalidated while you're I think John Locke called it the tabula rasa, like you just are an empty slate and you get filled, that slate gets filled up by the information that you're handed by the educator. And his complaint was that a lot of the communist movements at the time were just repeating this pedagogy, this same authoritarian pedagogy, and he's asking the question, how are you supposed to liberate people? They're going to maintain a sense of alienation. They're not going to feel free to be their authentic selves so long as we educate people in this way. And he goes on to explain the variety of ways in which this kind of pedagogy maintains this state of oppression over time, and that no liberation experience is actually going to occur. It's the old adage of, hey, we're replacing the old boss with the new boss, right? And he was seeing the communist movements in Soviet Russia and in Maoist China as falling prey to this, and that it wasn't actually going to make a change. In his belief system, he felt like, and this goes back to, if you've seen my interview with Julianne Romanello, where we discussed sophism versus the Socratic dialogue, it's very similar. The pedagogy of the oppressed would be represented by the sophists, and what you really want to try to do, if you're educating a person to be an authentic human being, is to teach them how to critically think for themselves and have respect for their own experience and come from their own place and realize that their experience is valid. And then, according to Freire, this prevents the type of alienation that he saw as endemic in the colonized world. The capitalist oppressing forces of colonization. He was from Brazil, so he was coming from that South American perspective. I wanted to have Cynthia on, Dr. McKinney on, to talk about this, and over the course of the year, it just kind of developed into having a deeper conversation too, including, of course, what's been going on with the pandemic and how everyone is getting treated in terms of the pandemic. And so I was really excited to be able to have her on to finally talk about this really incredible book and continue to bridge that gap between the left and the right, as we described in the interview, about finding different paths forward through dialogue, not through the dialectic, the left-right paradigm, but through dialogue, as to how we can work together and how we can create a future that serves all of humanity, and not just, people that think one way, people that think another way. And then, of course, as the conversation got deeper, we really discussed some of these ideas about how people who self-identify as either left or right on the paradigm, they're able to kind of spoon-feed propaganda And they know if you self-identify as left, you're going to think this way. We can say, hey, if you're left wing, this is how you think. If you're right wing, this is how you think. And then we're constantly fighting each other. Classic divide and conquer strategy. We never unite. We never unite as a force of liberation against this kind of colonial oppression. The other thing I really appreciated by having her on, of course, as an African-American woman, was that I had another opportunity to have a bit of a conversation about the racial issue, which I think is another form of divide and conquer as well, and how we can have these discussions between our two different perspectives and really find a heck of a lot of common ground, especially when we start to use those listening skills, engaging in dialogue, and not being so rigid. Dr. McKinney talked about being flexible with your self-identity, being able to take, every unique situation as it comes, and being able to be flexible and kind of roll with every new subject, every new issue that comes out, and not just being the kind of person that can self-identify as a particular political type and then be so instantly affected by the propaganda as it rolled out. And of course, within the context of all of those ideas, we could talk about coronavirus and the pandemic. Of course, the pedagogy of the oppressed is right there in a lot of the propaganda that we're getting from the government corporate sector in terms of when we hear about the science has to be correct. There's not a debate between scientists. There's just a consensus of experts, and we have to listen to the experts. But of course, the experts are only the ones that are sanctioned by the corporate government system, and any experts that disagree with that are censored, And so we're not having a dialogue. I mean, there's a really stark form of the dialectic that's right in your face. And then, of course, the concerns are that once you're engaged in that kind of pedagogy, the oppression is a psychological oppression. You're participating in being oppressed just because of the way that you think about the notion of truth, and that you're not really paying attention to what the other person is saying, the other side is saying. You're not giving respect to their cultural history or background. You're posing some kind of objective truth that comes from on high. It's kind of the classic patriarchal mythology, right? The truth comes from on high, from the expert, and we all just ingest it because our brains are these empty bank accounts that have to be filled by the authority figure. So anyway, it was just a wonderful conversation. I'm glad we finally had it, and it looked like she had a good time too, so I hope I'll be able to have her back on the show here in a couple of months so we can continue this. I'd actually spoken with her once before with conservative activist Robert David Steele, who passed away just recently, a few months back. And they were working on the hashtag unrigged movement, which was also working to bridge this left-right divide. I mean, I think Dr. McKinney certainly agrees with me, and one of the things I try to talk about on this program certainly is we've got to get over this. So this classic divide and conquer, I see it in so many people where the mainstream media, the corporate narrative, can just get fed to the left or to the right, and people are just going to ingest it and fight to the bone for their side, and that prevents the unity that's going to lead to liberation. So hopefully we all learned a little bit from the dialogue that I just had, and it was very refreshing to have that conversation with her, someone that, ordinarily would be on the opposite side of the spectrum, but we found so much common ground, and we realized what's really the important end game here is that people can be free, that people aren't alienated from their true nature, and they can discover themselves and feel comfortable. Feel like they're in a safe space to express themselves through dialogue, and not constantly participating in this authoritarian pedagogy that just continues the cycle of violence. So I really appreciated the conversation with Cynthia. Hope you did too. And I'll just remind you, actually, I'll give out her website here. You can find all the information about her and her books at www.allthingscynthiamckinney.com. When China Sneezes has, I think there were 10 or 11 different chapters, all written by different people. Cynthia wrote the last one herself, but also including one chapter by Whitney Webb that was really good, and a lot of other good thinkers too. That really kind of put the whole coronavirus thing in perspective, especially as it came out so early, just the summer of 2020. So again, all things CynthiaMcKinney.com. You can check out all of her stuff there. So I want to thank you again for checking out this program, and just remind you that you can find me. I'm on Facebook, my personal page, Doug McKenty, on Twitter at DMcKenty, and all of my videos are posted on Rockfin, Odyssey, and you can find the audio pretty much on all the podcast distribution sites, and just go to www.theshiftnow.com, where you can find all my work posted there. That's the best place to go. Sign up for the newsletter and I'll keep you informed. So thanks again for listening. My next interview coming up soon. It's already in the can. I've kind of, this December, because of the holidays, doing them all back to back here, is with author Donald Jeffries. We're going to go off the beaten path a little bit, and we're going to talk about Hollywood and the history of Hollywood and the intrigues. It's not really political, actually. It's going to be more just about the crazy lifestyle, the financial disparity, why some people make it and some people don't in Hollywood. So stay tuned for that one. It'll be coming out soon. All right, thanks again, and you all have a great week. We'll see you soon. Take care.